The note was written in red marker on a piece of torn cardboard. "Cry for it, baby." Jake Miller, 11 years old, stood in the early morning light of a Wednesday in August and read those 4 words 17 times. Not because he didn't understand them the first time. He understood them perfectly. He read them 17 times because reading them was easier than looking up. Because looking up meant seeing what they had done. When he finally raised his eyes, he made a sound he had never made before. A sound too small to be a scream and too broken to be a sob. A sound that lived in the space between the two, like an animal hit by a car, but not yet dead. Rex's memorial was gone. Not moved. Not knocked over. Gone. The flat stone he had shaped himself. The one he'd hauled from the quarry at the edge of town in a wagon with 3 days of sore arms. The one he painted with weatherproof paint in careful golden letters. REX. Good boy. Best friend. 2013 to 2023 had been reduced to rubble. Chunks of pale granite lay scattered across the flower bed. The marigolds he'd planted around the base had been torn up by their roots. The small photograph of Rex he'd laminated and pressed into the stone had been ripped out and torn in half, both pieces face down in the dirt. Jake stood there for a long time. Then he sat down in the dirt, picked up both halves of the photograph, and held them together in his lap. He didn't cry. He was past crying. What he didn't know, what no one on Maple Street knew yet, was that in 48 hours, the sound of 1,000 motorcycle engines would be the first thing this town heard at dawn. Jake Miller had exactly $47.23 when summer started. He knew the precise amount because he'd been counting it since April, stacking quarters, smoothing dollar bills flat against the edge of his dresser on the days when he caught himself staring at the empty corner of the backyard and felt the familiar, shapeless weight settle in his chest. The weight had a name. He didn't say it out loud much anymore, but in the private ledger of his internal life, it was always there, tallied in the same column as the image of his father's laugh as heard through digital static, as the phantom warmth of a large golden body at the foot of his bed. That corner had been Rex's corner. A golden retriever of 10 years, Rex had arrived in the Miller house before Jake could walk. In the only home video Jake had ever seen of his first birthday, a pudgy, uncertain Jake took his first 2 steps across a living room floor while Rex walked beside him, shoulder to shoulder, as if he had understood from the very beginning that his job was to be steady when Jake was not. His father, Mike Miller, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, laughing the laugh that later existed only in corrupted pixels, filmed the whole thing from the couch. Jake had watched that video so many times the file had pixelated beyond recovery. He watched it anyway. You could still hear his father laugh. Mike Miller had died on a February night 3 years ago. Black ice on Route 9. Sandra had been at her shift at the grocery store when the call came. Jake had been asleep, Rex curled warm against his legs. And when Sandra came home in the middle of the night and sat on the edge of his bed and put her hand on his shoulder and said the words, Rex had lifted his great golden head and pressed it into Sandra's side. He had stayed there for a full hour, like he understood, like he knew that sometimes the only thing you can offer is the weight of your presence, the simple animal fact of being there. After Mike was gone, it was Rex who kept Jake sleeping through the night. Rex whose warmth against Jake's back made mornings bearable. Rex who, on the worst days, would find Jake wherever he was hiding, under the porch, in the closet, behind the shed, and simply lied down beside him without asking anything at all. Jake was 8 when his father died. He was 9 when something happened at Callaway Pond that Jake never talked about. It had been December, cold enough that the surface of the pond looked solid but wasn't. The kind of deceptive cold that the Northeast specializes in. The cold that kills not through honesty, but through appearance. Jake had been chasing a tennis ball he'd thrown too hard. The kind of stupid, careless thing that 9-year-old boys do when no one is watching. And he'd gone through the ice up to his waist before he understood what was happening. The water was so cold it stopped his lungs completely. He couldn't scream, couldn't pull himself out. He just held the edge of broken ice with both hands and started to go numb from the outside inward. Rex had found the tennis ball 10 feet away and ignored it. He had barked. He had barked with an intensity that 11-year-old Jake still couldn't find words for. A sound less like a dog and more like an alarm, like a living emergency broadcast. And it had brought Margaret Hollis out of her back door and down to the pond in her house slippers before she fully understood why she was running. Between the two of them, Rex holding Jake's sleeve in his teeth and Margaret pulling with both arms. They got Jake out. Jake had pneumonia for 2 weeks afterward. Rex had slept at the foot of his bed the entire time, moving only to eat and drink, and then coming right back, reclaiming his post with the seriousness of a soldier who understood that the mission was not yet finished. When Rex died in March of this year, old age, quietly, in his sleep, at the foot of Jake's bed exactly where he always was, Jake had not eaten properly for 5 days. Sandra had sat with him and not pushed the eating. She knew some grief requires its full duration and cannot be hurried through without leaving something behind. The memorial had been Jake's idea entirely. He hadn't told his mother until he'd already started planning it, because he worried she might say it wasn't practical, or it was too much work, or some other reasonable and devastating thing. He'd pulled up tutorials on the school library's computer. He'd learned what type of stone was easiest to work, what paint was weatherproof, how deep a concrete footing needed to be. He'd drawn 12 drafts of the design in a spiral notebook before settling on the final version, a flat oval of pale granite, hand-lettered, with a carved outline of a running dog in the upper corner, front paws extended, ears back, full stride. The $47.23 had been enough for the stone, the tools, the paint, and the marigolds. Barely. He'd had 63 cents left over, which he put back in the jar on his dresser, feeling somehow that even saving 63 cents was a form of respect, that Rex deserved a budget managed with care. He worked on it for 3 weekends in July, his hands blistered and then calloused. He learned that granite resists the chisel with a personality, that you can't force it, that you have to find the grain and follow it, which struck him as a lesson that might apply to things beyond stone. The letters came out slightly uneven, which bothered him for 2 days until his mother looked at them and said, "They look like a kid made them. They look like love." And he had decided she was right. He set the stone in the back corner of the yard on the last Sunday of July, with Sandra standing beside him in the heat and Margaret Hollis watching from over the fence with a hand pressed to her chest. "That's a beautiful thing, Jake," Margaret said. "Your father would be real proud." Jake had just nodded. He didn't trust his voice. The whole block came by that week, one by one. The way people come to something they don't have a formal occasion for but understand to be important. Mrs. Patterson brought a small potted rosemary bush to plant beside the stone. "It's for remembrance," she said, and Jake had looked it up later and found out she was right. Rosemary for remembrance, an old tradition, older than anyone on Maple Street. Old Don Weaver from number 14 had stood with his hat in his hands for a long time, reading the letters, before finally saying, quietly, "Good dog. Good dog." Even Tommy Chin's grandmother, who barely spoke English, had stopped on the sidewalk and pressed her palms together and bowed her head slightly. And Jake hadn't known exactly what it meant, but it had felt like something sacred and cross-cultural and fundamentally correct. For 2 weeks, Jake visited the corner every morning before school and every evening before dinner. He kept the marigolds watered. He talked to Rex, quietly, the way people talk to the dead when they know they're not being heard but can't stop themselves, because the words need somewhere to go. He never saw Tommy Chin coming. Nobody did. Tommy Chun was 14 years old and had never, in any meaningful sense, been told no. His father, Alan Chun, owned the largest car dealership in 3 counties, sat on the town council, and had spent 14 years confusing provision with affection and compliance with love. He gave Tommy things instead of time. He gave Tommy permission instead of boundaries. He gave Tommy the understanding, communicated through years of accumulated behavior, that the rules that governed ordinary people were a kind of suggestion from which the Chun family was partially exempt. This had given Tommy the particular kind of confidence that lives exactly one bad decision away from cruelty. The confidence of a person who has never had to calculate consequences because the consequences have always been managed by someone else. He had 3 boys who followed him the way iron filings follow a magnet, not out of affection, not out of loyalty, but because Tommy was the strongest gravitational field in the room and they didn't know how to resist it. Derek Walsh was the closest thing to a friend, which was to say that Derek had spent 3 years laughing at Tommy's jokes a half second after everyone else and telling himself this was friendship. Tommy had made Jake's life difficult at school since 3rd grade, knocked lunch trays, mocked the worn elbows of Jake's jackets. Once, in 5th grade, He had pulled Jake's backpack off his shoulders and dumped it in a puddle while 8 other kids watched. Jake had picked everything up without saying a word, which had made Tommy angrier than any response could have. He preferred noise. Silence felt like defiance. The memorial had bothered Tommy in a way he couldn't have explained. Part of it was that people cared about it. That Jake Miller, this quiet, borderline poor kid with the dead dad and the patched sneakers, had built something with his bare hands that made grown adults stop and take their hats off. It violated some internal accounting Tommy wasn't consciously aware of running. The ledger that kept track of who was supposed to matter and how much, and which had been miscalibrated from the beginning. He planned it the way he planned most things. Impulsively, late at night, texting in the dark of his bedroom. You coming or not? Not a question. It never was. They came. They arrived at the back fence of number 7 Maple Street at 11:47 p.m. Tommy had a baseball bat. Derek had a short-handled spade. The other two had flashlights they kept low. The street was quiet. The sky was the deep, suffocated blue of a summer midnight. It took 11 minutes. The stone was heavier than Tommy expected. The first blow didn't crack it, just rang through the bat into his palms and shoulders, a shock he hadn't anticipated. He hit it again, and again. The third blow split it through. The fourth hit the flowers. The laminated photograph he pulled out with his own fingers and tore it clean in half and dropped both pieces in the dirt. Derek looked at him when it was done. Derek's expression was not triumphant. Derek looked like a person who had done something in a half-dream and was now afraid of waking up. Tommy, write the note, Tommy said. Derek wrote it on a piece of cardboard from his jacket pocket, in red marker, in his own hand. Cry for it, baby. He put it on the largest piece of broken stone. They were gone before midnight. Margaret Hollis heard the sound of the bat hitting granite from her bedroom window. She had been a light sleeper since her son Ray died 7 years ago. Grief had permanently altered her relationship with the dark, made every unexpected sound into a possible emergency. She saw the flashlights. She saw the shapes moving in Jake's yard. She tried to call out. The window was stiff and painted shut at the sides, and by the time she got it open enough to lean out, the yard was already empty and quiet. She stood at the window for a long time in the dark. Then she picked up her phone and turned on its flashlight and looked at what was left of the memorial. The stone in pieces. The flowers destroyed. The photograph in the dirt. Oh, honey, she said to no one. To Jake. To whatever spirit keeps watch over the places where the dead have been properly honored. Oh, honey, no. She took 11 photographs. Then she sat on the edge of her bed, and she cried for a while. Not for herself. She was 72 years old and had cried for herself plenty and knew the difference. But for an 11-year-old boy who had $47.23 and blistered hands and love that didn't have anywhere else to go, and she cried for that love, which had been built into something tangible and then deliberately destroyed by people who did not understand its weight. When she was done, she woke up her daughter Kelly, who was visiting from Portland, and said, I need you to help me put something on the internet. Margaret Hollis had a Facebook account she used primarily for 2 things, recipes involving slow cookers and updates from the Maple Street community group. She had 312 friends, most of whom she had never met, and she posted approximately once a month, usually a photograph of something in her garden with a brief caption. At 2:14 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, she posted 11 photographs of Jake Miller's destroyed memorial. Kelly had tried to help her write the caption, but Margaret had waved her off gently. I'll do it myself. She typed slowly, with her reading glasses on, in the blue light of the phone screen, making small corrections when the autocorrect tried to improve her words into something that wasn't her. This is my neighbor's yard. That little boy Jake is 11 years old, and he spent his whole summer saving up money, and he built that stone himself with his own 2 hands for his dog Rex, who passed away in March. Rex saved that boy's life at Callaway Pond 3 years ago, and Rex was his daddy's dog before his daddy passed away. Jake is a good, quiet boy, and he doesn't have much, and he put everything he had into that stone. Somebody came in the night and smashed it all to pieces. They left him a note that says, cry for it, baby. I am 72 years old and I have seen a lot of things, but I am sitting here in the dark and I am ashamed of whoever did this. If anyone can help, please share this. Kelly shared it first. Then a woman in the Maple Street community group shared it to a general neighborhood network. Then a woman named Sharon in Pittsburgh, who had lost her own dog 2 years ago and had never entirely recovered from it. and who understood in her bones the specific gravity of pet grief, the way it carries the weight of everything the animal had witnessed, shared it to a pet loss support group with 60,000 members. Someone in that group shared it to a general news aggregator. A journalist with a small but active following shared it with a brief comment. This is everything wrong and everything right about America in one story. Wrong. Whoever did this. Right. Watch what happens next. Watch. She didn't know what would happen next. She was, it turned out, correct that it would be worth watching. By 6 a.m., the post had 400 shares. By 8 a.m., 14,000. By the time Jake sat down in the dirt on Maple Street with the two halves of Rex's photograph in his lap, Margaret's post had been shared 22,000 times, and the number was climbing like a tide coming in. Carla read, Jenkins saw it at 6:18 a.m., while drinking her first coffee of the day in the kitchen of her apartment in Trenton, New Jersey. She was 45 years old, had red hair, she'd worn the same way for 15 years, and had ridden with the Iron Brotherhood Motorcycle Club for 19 of them. She'd come up through the Women's Auxiliary at 26, earned her full membership patch at 36, and was currently the club's secretary and de facto communications director. She was not a sentimental woman. You don't spend 2 decades in a world built on steel, road noise, and the kind of loyalty that requires no explanation without developing a certain functional hardness. But she had a dog of her own, a 7-year-old pit bull named Duchess, and she had a mother in a nursing home in Newark she called every night, and something about Margaret Hollis's 2 a.m. post, the slow, careful typing, the reading glasses, the 72-year-old woman alone in the dark, doing the only thing she could think to do, landed in Carla in a place that had no armor on it. She began to share it. Then she stopped. She scrolled back to the original post. Read it again. Looked at the address and the photographs. Looked at the street sign visible in the background of one image. 7 Maple Street, Calder Township. She put her coffee mug down. Looked at the last name in the caption again. Miller. She said, "Oh my God," to her empty kitchen. Then she called Bones. Bobby Bones. Morrison had been president of the Iron Brotherhood's main chapter for 11 years, and in that time, he had developed a finely calibrated instinct for phone calls that were about to change something. It lived in the pause between the ring and the voice, the particular quality of the air before words. He answered on the second ring. Red. It's early. I know. Carla's voice was careful in a way it usually wasn't. She was not, as a rule, a person who handled words with tongs. I need you to look at something. He looked at it. The coffee in his mug went cold. The name Miller. The address in Calder Township. A town he knew. A street he had driven down on a February night years ago in a car that wasn't his because his hands had been shaking too hard to hold a wheel. He knew that yard, that corner, that house. He knew them because there had been a dog in that yard. A golden dog who had leaned against the passenger door of Mike's car the whole drive to the hospital, while Mike Miller ran every red light on Route 9 and talked to Bones in a steady, calm voice the entire time. The voice of a man who was afraid, but had decided fear was not currently relevant. Cardiac arrest. He'd been 51 years old. In his apartment alone on a February night. He should have died there. He'd been alone, and his phone had been in the bedroom, and his body had been doing something that would have been irreversible in 6 more minutes. Rex had smelled it, not seen it, not heard it, smelled something in the air that changed, the way dogs smell things we have no sensory apparatus to perceive. He'd been in the yard next door, in the cold, and he had begun to bark. Not the way dogs bark at squirrels or at other dogs, or at the particular enemy they have identified in the garbage truck. The way dogs bark when they need a human to understand that something is wrong right now, and the urgency cannot wait, and the communication must penetrate whatever the human is doing. He had barked until Mike woke up. Mike Miller, who hadn't spoken to Bones in 6 months over a piece of club stupidity that both of them were too proud to walk back, had looked out his window at 2 a.m. because a dog was barking, had seen the light on in Bones's apartment, and had understood something without being able to say how, and had gone in through the unlocked door and found Bones on the floor, and called 911, and stayed on the phone, and ridden in the ambulance, and sat in the hospital for 4 days. They had made up in that hospital. All the stupidity and pride burned away in the fluorescent light of a cardiac ward, replaced by something simpler and more durable. 11 months after Bones walked out of that hospital, Mike Miller was dead on Route 9. Bones had attended the funeral. He'd stood at the very back of the crowd, in civilian clothes with no club insignia, because he hadn't known if Sandra Miller would want a biker at her husband's funeral, and because some grief requires careful management of space. He'd left before the end. He'd driven back to Trenton and sat in his office in the clubhouse for a long time, not doing anything, just sitting in the particular silence of a man who has outlived someone who made it possible for him to be alive to outlive anyone. He had sent money to Sandra twice over the years, anonymously, through routes that couldn't be traced. He didn't know if it had been enough. He knew it hadn't been. There was no amount that was enough, and he had known that going in, but had sent it anyway, because sometimes the gesture is the only thing you have to give, and you give it. Now he was looking at a photograph of Mike Miller's son sitting in the dirt beside the ruins of a memorial the boy had built with $47 and his own 2 hands. Bones was silent for 37 seconds. Carla let him be. "Call everyone," he said. Those 2 words in Bobby Morrison's voice meant something very specific in the world of the Iron Brotherhood. They meant all 17 East Coast chapters, from Portland, Maine to Richmond, Virginia. They meant the allied clubs in the network, the Iron Wolves out of Baltimore, the Asphalt Saints from Philadelphia, the Road Keepers from Connecticut, the Granite Runners from Vermont, the Blue Ridge Thunder out of Western North Carolina. They meant the informal network of independent riders who had participated in Brotherhood charity events and knew the frequency to listen to. They meant 1,000 wheels, minimum. "How many do you want?" Carla asked. "All of them," Bones said. "Tell them to bring tools." The call went out at 7 a.m. Wednesday. Danny Diesel Torres, the club's vice president, received it while eating breakfast. Eggs, toast, black coffee. The same breakfast he had eaten every day for 22 years. He put down his fork, picked up his laptop, and began to work with the calm efficiency of a man with a mechanical engineering degree he almost never mentioned. By 8 a.m., Diesel had created a coordination channel, distributed a detailed supply list, assigned specific roles to each chapter, calculated convoy routes from 7 points of origin, and filed for emergency event permits with Calder Township's municipal office under the provisions of the New Jersey, Pennsylvania Regional Civic Assembly Ordinance. He'd done this in under an hour, while finishing his breakfast. By 9 a.m., riders from Boston were heading south on I-95. Riders from Richmond were heading north. From Hartford, from Baltimore, from Philadelphia, from Providence, from every point of the compass, the sound was building. In Calder Township, New Jersey, Jake Miller was sitting on his bed with the 2 halves of Rex's photograph taped carefully together on his desk, staring at nothing, while Sandra, who had called the police at 7 a.m. and watched Officer Hendricks take a 12-minute report and say he'd look into it and leave, stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands and felt the particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent years navigating a world that was built for other people. She went back inside and made Jake pancakes he didn't eat. At the table, neither of them spoke much. Outside, the morning was ordinary, blue sky, birdsong, the distant sound of a lawnmower from somewhere up the block. Neither of them could hear, not yet, what was coming. Calder Township woke up on Thursday morning to a sound it had never heard before. It arrived at 5:40 a.m., before the sun had cleared the tree line at the east end of town. A vibration more than a noise at first, the kind of deep, sustained, multi-toned rumble that settles in the sternum before it reaches the ears. It was the sound of engines, dozens and then hundreds of them, their individual voices merging into something that resembled a geological event, a pressure front moving horizontally across the surface of the world. Dogs went to windows. Children sat up in bed. Old Don Weaver put down his morning crossword, walked to his front door, and stood on his porch in his slippers with his mouth open. Margaret Hollis, who had barely slept, sat in her kitchen chair and heard the sound build and put one hand over her heart and said, quietly and to no one, "Come on then." They came down Route 9 first, a river of headlights stretching back past the horizon, an unbroken stream moving steadily, maintaining its intervals with a patience that was itself a kind of statement. Then they turned onto Maple Street. Maple Street was not a wide street. It had been laid out in 1947, designed for the modest domestic traffic of a mid-century American neighborhood. 1,000 motorcycles did not fit on it. They filled it end to end and spilled onto Elm and Cherry and the adjacent blocks, parked in tight, disciplined rows along the curbs. In the lot of Calder Township Elementary School 2 blocks away, in the field behind the Methodist church. Trucks and vans interspersed with the bikes, loaded with supplies. And still they came. Riders in leather vests with patches, and riders in plain gear without. Men and women and everyone in between. Old riders with silver hair tucked under helmets who had been on the road since the 1970s, and riders in their 20s for whom this was their first organized run. A group of 8 women from a club in Hartford who had stopped at a nursery at 4 in the morning and were now carrying flat trays of perennials across their handlebars. A retired schoolteacher from Rhode Island who rode a 1978 Honda that should not have made the trip, but had, and who had brought her husband's old stone carving tools in a canvas bag because she'd once learned to carve and had a feeling they'd be useful. They were useful. Sheriff Pete Dawson arrived at 6:15 in his patrol cruiser, having been called by 3 separate residents in the space of 10 minutes. And when he turned the corner onto Maple Street and saw what was there, he stopped his car in the middle of the road. He sat for a moment. Pete Dawson was 55 years old and had been the sheriff of Calder Township for 16 years. He had managed bar fights, drug arrests, a flood in 2019 that put 6 families out of their homes, and one extremely complicated situation involving an escaped emu from a private farm. He had not managed anything that looked like this. He pulled forward to the front of the crowd, got out of his car, and straightened his hat with the practiced authority of a man trying to project more certainty than he felt. The crowd parted, naturally, without being asked. A corridor opened down the middle of Maple Street, lined on both sides by riders standing still, and at the end of that corridor, in the morning light, hands at his sides, pace unhurried, was a large man with a gray beard and the particular stillness of someone who has genuinely been in worse situations than this one. Bobby Morrison walked toward Pete Dawson and stopped at a respectful distance. "Morning, Sheriff." Pete looked at the man in front of him, looked past him at the 1,000 people filling his street, back at the man. "This is a residential area." "Yes, sir." Bones reached into the interior pocket of his vest and produced a folded document. He held it out. Calder Township Municipal Permit, Event Reference Number 2024, CB 1109. Emergency Variance, filed yesterday at 7:40 a.m., approved by Township Clerk Joan Mercer at 3 p.m. Noise Ordinance Waiver, Temporary Parking Variance, and road closure for the east block of Maple Street between numbers 1 and 20, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. He paused half a beat. "We're in compliance." Pete Dawson took the document. He read it. He read it again. "You filed this yesterday morning," he said. "Yes, sir. And it was approved by 3 in the afternoon. Joan Mercer runs a very tight office." Pete looked at the document for another moment. Then he looked up, and something passed through his expression that was complicated and honest, and somewhat uncomfortable. The look of a man recalibrating a long-held assumption in real time. He made a sound, a single, involuntary, short laugh. "Hell of a thing," he said, mostly to himself. "The boy's name is Jake Miller," Bones said. His voice changed on the name, quieter, more precise, like a man carrying something he didn't want to drop. "He's 11 years old. He built a memorial for his dog with his own money and his own hands, and somebody destroyed it in the night. We're here to fix that." A pause. "That's all. That's all." Pete folded the document, put it in his shirt pocket, looked at the crowd one more time. 1,000 people standing in the early morning light of a residential street in absolute, deliberate, almost ceremonial stillness, and arrived at a private conclusion. "I'll reroute the through traffic to Elm," he said. "Appreciate it, Sheriff." Pete drove away. His 2 deputies, stationed at the perimeter, looked at each other and reached a shared, unspoken understanding. Their function this morning was traffic management and nothing else. Inside number 7 Maple Street, Sandra Miller was standing at the kitchen window with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold. The street outside was full of motorcycles and leather and big, weathered people moving with calm purpose, and she was crying. Not the managed, contained crying of a woman performing emotion, but the deep, silent, unguarded kind that happens when something breaks through defenses that have been up for a long time. Jake stood beside her, his hand on the window ledge. A knock at the door. Sandra wiped her face with the back of her hand, went to the door, and opened it. Standing on the porch was a woman in her mid-40s, red hair under a green bandana, leather vest, and the most direct and uncomplicated eyes Sandra had seen since her own mother. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee, apparently retrieved from somewhere, and held one out. "Mrs. Miller," Carla Jenkins said, "Red. We're here to fix what they did to your boy's stone." She paused. "If that's all right with you." Sandra looked at her, looked past her at the street, looked back. She took the coffee. "Come in," she said. By 7 a.m., Maple Street had been reorganized according to a plan that had been assembled in a 12-hour period with the kind of precision usually associated with infrastructure projects or military logistics. Diesel had done it all the night before: materials procurement, role assignments, task sequencing, convoy coordination, permit filing. 2 pickup trucks had arrived at 5 a.m. carrying granite slabs from a supplier in Reading, Pennsylvania, who had driven through the night when he heard what the stone was for and, when Diesel attempted to process payment, had said flatly, "Don't insult me," and hung up. Among the 1,000 riders, the relevant skills were present in remarkable abundance. 4 stone carvers, 2 professional, and 2 extensively experienced amateurs. A retired construction foreman named Victor from Hartford who had built foundations for 40 years and viewed concrete with the exacting standards of a man who believed it was possible to be right about something this specific. A landscape architect from Boston who rode an Indian Scout and had brought her own design sketches, drafted on the highway with her passenger holding a flashlight. An electrician from the Baltimore chapter. A plumber. 12 people with strong backs and detailed knowledge of flowers. And everyone else who could lift things, clear things, hold things, hand things up, and work with the quiet efficiency of people who had spent decades doing difficult things together. They divided by skill and began. The stone carvers took the primary granite, working from enlarged photographs of Jake's original design that Elena, 44 years old, from Providence, who had been carving stone professionally since she was 22, had spent the drive down studying. She had noticed something in the photographs that she had not mentioned to anyone yet. She was saving it. Victor's foundation team broke ground at 7:10, digging to proper depth, laying gravel drainage, mixing concrete to a specification he explained to his 3-person crew with the tone of a man who takes no shortcuts and accepts none in others. "This stone," he said quietly, troweling the form smooth, "does not move again. Ever. Are we clear?" They were clear. In front of the house, Sandra's yard became the site of a different kind of operation. A group of 8 people, quietly, after asking permission for each task, began addressing the small structural and maintenance failures that accumulate in the house of a single working mother over years. The broken gutter over the front window, the porch step that gave slightly underfoot, the faucet in the kitchen that had dripped since the previous October. They worked without commentary, without drama, as people work when they understand the difference between charity and solidarity. Jake stood at the edge of the yard and watched for the first 40 minutes, holding the 2 halves of the photograph. He was aware of the scale of what was happening in a way that was not fully comprehensible. 1,000 people. In his yard. On his street. For Rex. For him. It was too large for any frame his 11-year-old mind currently had. And so he stood at the edge of it and watched in a state of quiet suspension, waiting for his understanding to catch up with the facts. A man sat down on the porch step beside him. A big man, gray beard, moving with the small caution of repaired knees. Jake hadn't seen him approach. He just appeared beside him the way certain people appear, without announcement, without requiring notice. He was a golden retriever, the man said, nodding at the photograph. Jake looked at him sideways. Yeah, good dogs. Goldens. A pause. What was his name? Rex. Good name. Another pause. My name's Bones. Jake absorbed this. Is that a nickname? Everything's a nickname in our world. What's your real name? Bobby. Jake considered it for a moment. Bones is better. The corner of Bobby Morrison's mouth moved approximately 3 millimeters in a direction that, on other people, might have been called a broad smile. I've always thought so. They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, watching the work unfold. Why did you come? Jake asked, not as a challenge, as genuine curiosity, the uncomplicated, direct curiosity of a child who has not yet learned that some questions are supposed to go unasked. Bones considered the real answer. He was not ready to give it yet. Because what they did was wrong, he said. And because when wrong things can be made right, they should be. He looked at Jake. And because when 1,000 people heard what happened to your dog, they all felt the same thing. Jake was quiet for a moment. Then, that's a lot of people. 1,012, Bones said, last count. At 10:30 a.m., a black Mercedes SUV appeared at the edge of Maple Street. Alanchen got out. His son Tommy got out after him, moving with the particular stiffness of a teenager who has been told to do something he hates and told in a way that did not allow argument. The crowd did not part this time. It opened, watchfully, with a quality of attention that was different from the respectful corridor for Bones, less welcoming and more deliberate. Tommy walked through it and felt something he had never felt before, the combined weight of 1,000 people's quiet and considered judgment. It was not aggressive. It was, in some ways, worse than aggression. Aggression was familiar. This patient, silent, witnessing attention, had no familiar form in his experience. He looked small, not in the way of height or age, in the way that comes from the inside, when what you have done fills the space between yourself and everyone watching. Jake saw them at the edge of the work zone. He stood up. Tommy Chin looked at the broken pieces of the original stone, still piled deliberately to one side. He looked at the two torn halves of the photograph that Jake was still holding, taped together with careful strips. He looked at Jake's face, and in Jake's face, not anger, not hatred, something calmer and more absolute than either. He looked at what he had done. He said quietly, "I'm sorry." Jake looked at him for a long time. "The note," Jake said, "was that your handwriting?" Tommy nodded. Jake looked down at the photograph. Rex mid-stride, ears back, full of life and velocity. He looked back up. "Rex saved my life," Jake said. "Did you know that?" Tommy shook his head. "He was my dad's dog first. My dad died when I was 8. Jake's voice was steady, not performing strength, just stating facts with the precision of a person who has had to live with them. "Rex stayed with me. When I fell through the ice at Callaway Pond, Rex pulled me out. He held my sleeve in his teeth until the neighbor came." A pause. That stone wasn't just about a dog. It was about everything he meant. My dad, and the pond, and the years after. Everything. The 1,000 people on Maple Street were very, very quiet. Tommy Chin looked at the ground. A single muscle worked in his jaw. When he looked up, something in his face was different, not transformed, not miraculously altered, but shifted, the way something shifts when it has been shown its own weight for the first time. "I'm sorry," he said again, and this time it was not a sentence. It was something that hurt to say, and was said anyway. "I know," Jake said. It was not forgiveness. It was not the absence of forgiveness. It was the acknowledgement of receipt, the way you sign for something before you know what you'll do with it. But it was honest, and in its honesty it was more than Tommy had expected to receive, and he stood there for a moment with it before his father put a hand on his shoulder and said, quietly, "Come on." Bones, watching from the porch, exhaled very slowly. It was early afternoon, the light golden and beginning to slant, when Bones found Jake in the backyard sitting by the foundation where the new stone would go. The concrete was curing. Victor's crew had wrapped it and moved on to other tasks. The garden around it was already half-planted, a landscape architect directing 3 others with the focused intensity of someone doing something permanent. Jake sat a few feet away on an upturned bucket, drawing in his notebook, mechanical pencil, careful lines, the close attention of a person who draws when they need to feel in control of something. Bones came around the corner of the house, and Jake looked up, and something about the old man's expression, careful, weighing something, the look of a person carrying a fragile object and calculating the best way to set it down, made Jake close the notebook. "Can I talk to you about something?" Bones said. Jake nodded. Bones sat down in the grass with the slight caution of 2 repaired knees and looked at the wrapped foundation for a moment. He was quiet long enough that Jake understood this wasn't stalling. This was the behavior of a person choosing words with precision because the words were going to matter. "How much did your mom tell you about your father's life before?" Bones said. "The full picture." Jake considered. "Some things. Not everything. She says some things take time." "Your dad rode," Bones said. "You know that?" "Yeah. He had a bike in the garage for a while." A pause. "Mom sold it when I was 9. She needed the money. I understood. He was one of us. Iron Brotherhood." Bones said it simply, without drama. "He joined at 24, rode with us for 8 years. He was He stopped and picked the word with unusual care. He was the kind of man the rest of us measured ourselves against. Not because he was loud or hard, because he was steady. Because when something needed doing, Mike Miller was already halfway done with it before anyone else had finished deciding. Jake had gone completely still. The particular stillness of a child receiving true information about a parent they lost before they could fully know them. Receiving it the way dry ground receives water, immediately, completely, without resistance. He talked about you, Bones said. All the time. He called you his best thing. Jake's throat moved. He looked at the wrapped foundation. The year before he died, your dad and I had a falling out, Bones said. Club politics. The kind of thing that seems enormous in the moment and turns out to be nothing, which you only understand after someone is gone, and the thing that seemed enormous has deflated into the foolishness it always was. He looked at his hands. We weren't speaking. 6 months, maybe 7. And then, he paused, started again. In February, I moved temporarily to a place on your block. After a situation with my own house. I was there maybe 3 weeks. He stopped again. Jake waited. One night, I had a heart attack, Bones said. In my apartment. Alone. I was 51 years old, and I was on the floor of my apartment, and I was going to die there, because my phone was in the other room and I couldn't get to it, and there was no one who would have looked for me until the next day. Jake looked at him with the absolute, unblinking attention of a child who has learned that the people you love can be taken without warning, and has recalibrated accordingly. Rex was in your yard, Bones said. Outside, in the cold. And he smelled something, the way dogs can smell things we can't. Changes in the air, in a person, something that tells them a fact we don't have the equipment to perceive. And he started to bark. He paused. Not the way dogs bark at squirrels. The way they bark when they need someone to understand that something is wrong right now, and the urgency is not optional. He looked at Jake directly. He barked until your dad woke up. Your dad, who I was not speaking to, who I had treated badly over a piece of foolishness that neither of us should have let go so far. Your dad looked out his window at 2 in the morning because a dog wouldn't stop barking, and he saw the light on in my window, and he understood something without being able to say how. He broke my door in, called 911, stayed on the phone, rode in the ambulance with me, stayed in that hospital for 4 days straight. Bones's voice was level, but it was the levelness of something held carefully, not of something that didn't feel. We made up in that hospital. Everything stupid and prideful burned away in about 30 minutes. We were brothers again. He stopped. The afternoon light came through the maple tree at the corner of the yard and lay in pieces on the ground, shifting slightly with the wind. And 11 months later, Jake said quietly, and 11 months later, Bones agreed. They sat with it for a moment. Rex saved your life, Jake said, working through the geometry of it slowly. The same way he saved mine. That dog, Bones said, saved 2 lives that I know of. And I believe more that I don't. He reached into the inner pocket of his vest with the careful deliberateness of a person retrieving something they've been carrying for a long time, and produced a photograph in a small plastic protective sleeve. He held it out. Jake took it. In the photograph, a younger Bones, beard brown instead of gray, 15 years lighter everywhere, sat on porch steps. These porch steps, Jake recognized, with a jolt. Beside Bones, leaning against his leg with the complete, golden, unself-conscious weight of a happy dog, was Rex. Younger Rex, ears perfect, eyes bright, the wide-open face of a dog in the middle of a good day. And standing behind them both, one hand on Bones's shoulder, head back, laughing at something the camera couldn't see, was Mike Miller. Jake had no photographs of his father laughing. None. He had holiday photographs, posed, composed, formal. He had one from a birthday with the expression of a man who knows he's being photographed and has arranged his face accordingly. He had the corrupted video, pixelated and static crossed, in which his father's laugh existed as a sound but not an image. He had believed, without quite articulating it, that his father's laugh existed only in that form, in sound, unrecoverable into the visible. But here was his father laughing, large and real and present, captured in the fraction of a second that a shutter opens and closes, preserved in silver and chemistry and the particular mercy of photography, which saves moments from the time that would otherwise consume them. Jake looked at his father's face in the photograph for a very long time. When he finally found his voice, It had a texture in it that he didn't try to manage. "Can I keep this?" "I brought it for you," Bones said. Jake held the photograph with both hands and was quiet. The garden work continued around them, unhurried. Someone was singing softly, somewhere on the other side of the fence. A motorcycle idled and then cut off. "He looks happy," Jake said finally. He was. That day, Bones looked at the photograph over Jake's shoulder. "We just finished a charity ride for the Children's Hospital in Trenton. Raised a little over $14,000 that year. Rex had ridden in your dad's sidecar rig. Your dad built a sidecar specifically for him. Rex sat up front the whole ride, looking out at the road like a senator reviewing his constituency." The corner of Bones's mouth moved. People came from 3 states to see the dog in the sidecar. He was the mascot. He was aware of it. He took it seriously. Jake made a sound that was half laugh and half something that had been waiting a long time to come out. "Your dad would be proud of what you built," Bones said. "The original stone. Not just because it was beautiful, though it was. Because you built it with your own hands and your own money for something you loved. That is," he paused, finding it. "That is the most Mike Miller thing I can imagine an 11-year-old doing." Jake was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the maple tree and the light shifted. Then he said, very quietly, "The way you say a thing when you've been holding it without words for a long time. I didn't know he had a whole life I didn't know about." "He did," Bones said. "And so do you, ahead of you." He looked at the garden being built around the empty space where the new stone would stand. "The best parts are still coming." At 4 p.m., Elena called everyone to the yard. She had been working since 7 that morning. Victor's foundation crew had finished at noon. 2 feet of reinforced concrete, drainage bedded correctly, leveled to a precision that Victor inspected on his knees with a straight edge and then stood up from with the expression of a man who is satisfied, which was an expression he wore rarely and meant it every time. The landscape team had built something around the site that had, in the course of a single day, become something more substantial than what had been there before, a layered garden of perennials chosen for hardiness and color and seasonal return, with a stone border and, to one side, a weathered wood bench at exactly the right height for a boy to sit on without his feet dangling. The stone itself was 3 feet by 2 feet, pale Vermont granite, thicker and more substantial than the original, chosen because this one, as Victor put it, without sentiment, as a structural statement, was going to be there when people currently alive were no longer alive, and nothing was going to move it. Elena had worked from enlarged photographs of Jake's original design, keeping the running dog in the upper corner, keeping the basic layout of the lettering. But she had noticed something in the photographs that she hadn't told anyone about yet, working it into her plan quietly all morning. Jake's original letters had been slightly uneven, not dramatically, not the uneven of a person who hadn't cared, the uneven of someone who had cared enormously and done their best, and whose best was 11 years old, and had blistered hands and a second-hand chisel and 3 weekends of practice. The letters leaned slightly, varied slightly in depth and spacing, were alive in the way that handmade things are alive. Elena was a professional stone carver of 20 years. She could reproduce perfectly even letters in her sleep. She had chosen not to. She had replicated Jake's imperfect letters with great technical skill, the slight lean, the variation, the living quality of something made by a child who was trying as hard as they knew how to try. She had done this because in 20 years of carving memorials, she had learned the difference between beauty and perfection, and between them, she always chose beauty, and beauty, in her experience, looked most like love. Below Rex's name and dates, in the same hand, she had added the line she had drafted on the drive down and revised over lunch, shown to Bones and Sandra, and finally, most importantly, Jake, who had read it in silence and then said, simply, yes. REX, who saved lives because he was loved and was loved because he saved lives. Below that, set slightly to the right, a smaller secondary panel in a clean, slightly different hand. And for Mike Miller, brother, father, best thing. Still writing. Sandra had cried when she saw the draft. She'd wiped her face and said, "That's exactly right," in a voice that closed the subject with finality. When the crew carried the finished stone to the foundation and began to lower it into place, the street went quiet. 1,000 people, who had been moving and working and talking and laughing and building all day, filling Maple Street with the productive noise of people doing something together, went silent. The stone settled into Victor's foundation with a soft, final sound. There is a quality that some objects have when they are placed correctly, an achieved rightness, a sense of having found the form they were always going to occupy. The new stone had this quality. It looked permanent, more permanent than the asphalt of the street, more permanent than the houses, more permanent than the maple tree at the corner of the yard. It looked as though it had always been there and would remain long after the last person currently present had gone somewhere else. Jake walked forward alone. He crossed the garden border and stood in front of the stone and read it. All of it, slowly, from beginning to end. He reached out and placed his palm flat against the letters of Rex's name, feeling the incised granite under his hand, the way you touch something to confirm it is real, to transfer knowledge from the skin into the deeper registers where things are kept. He stood there for a while. Nobody spoke. 1,000 people stood in the amber afternoon light of Maple Street and did not say anything, because this was one of those moments that words can only diminish, and 1,000 people who had spent their lives on open roads, where there is no noise but the engine and the wind and the silence between them, understood the value of letting a moment be what it was. Behind Jake, Sandra had put her arm around Carla Jenkins, who she had known for 9 hours and would know for the rest of her life. At the edge of the new garden, a monarch butterfly landed on a stem of the newly planted salvia, opened its wings once in the angled light, and was still. Jake turned around. His face was wet. He was smiling. The crowd exhaled, and then someone began to clap. A single pair of hands, somewhere near the back, and the sound moved through the 1,000 people like a wave moving through water, gathering and amplifying. And for 1 minute and 40 seconds, Maple Street made more noise than it ever had or ever would again. 2 days after the ride, Alan Shin appeared at Calder Township's Municipal Hall and made 3 public statements. The first, Tommy Chun would serve 200 hours of community service at the Calder Township Animal Shelter, beginning the following Saturday morning, continuing for 12 months without interruption. Tommy had been told this was non-negotiable. He had not argued, which was a first. Alan Shun, watching his son's face when he said it, had seen something in it that he didn't have a name for and couldn't evaluate, but filed away for future consideration. The second, a donation of $15,000 to the Calder Township Animal Shelter, made in the name of Rex Miller. The third, a letter delivered directly to Sandra Miller at number 7 Maple Street, in which Alan Shin communicated, in the careful language of a man who had spent considerable time with an attorney and considerable more time alone in a room deciding what he actually meant, his commitment to funding Jake's academic enrichment services through high school completion. Whether these actions were driven by genuine remorse or by the pragmatic calculation of a man who understood how badly the story could end if he let it continue in the direction it was heading is a question that cannot be answered cleanly, because remorse and calculation are not always opposites, and because motives are rarely single-threaded. What mattered was that the actions were taken, and that they were real, and that their value was independent of the purity of their origin. Tommy Chin showed up at the animal shelter on Saturday at 9 a.m. He spent 6 hours cleaning kennels, filling water bowls, chopping vegetables for the larger animals' feeding regimen. In the late afternoon, he sat in the outdoor yard with a 3-legged shepherd mix named Captain who had been there for 4 months without being adopted, and they sat together in the sun for an hour, and Tommy didn't take out his phone once. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. What that means is a question that only the next several years of his life will answer. But he came back. On Thursday evening, a week after the ride, Pete Dawson drove to number 7 Maple Street and knocked on the door. He took his hat off when Sandra answered. He asked if he could come in. He sat at her kitchen table and said several things that did not come easily, because Pete Dawson was not a man for whom difficult things came easily, but who had reached the age of 55 believing that the things that cost you something to say are usually the most worth saying. He told her he was sorry for how quickly Officer Hendricks had moved through the initial report, that it was not acceptable, and he had spoken with Hendricks about it, and expected better in the future. He told her his direct number was available to her for anything further she needed from his office. Then he said, "I went out there Thursday morning with a certain set of assumptions about who those people were, and I was wrong about most of them. I wanted you to know I know that." Sandra let him finish his coffee before she spoke. "Most people are more complicated than we assume," she said. "That's not a difficult lesson. It just requires paying attention. Pete Dawson nodded slowly. He had been paying better attention since Thursday morning. Carla Jenkins called Jake on Sunday. She'd gotten his number from Sandra. She asked how he was doing. He said mostly okay, getting better. She told him that Bones had asked her to pass on a standing open invitation. Whenever Jake wanted to attend a charity ride, there was a spot for him. Nothing formal, no obligation. Just an open door, for as long as he wanted it open. Jake said he'd think about it. He thought about it for approximately 2 minutes. Tell him yes, Jake said. He'll be glad, Carla said. Tell him I know about my dad, Jake said. Tell him I know about Rex and the apartment and everything. Tell him. He paused, finding it. Tell him thank you. For keeping it. For bringing it to me. On the other end of the line, Carla Jenkins was quiet for a moment. I'll tell him, she said. The road goes Owen. The last motorcycle left Maple Street at 6:47 p.m. on Thursday, at the edge of the golden hour, when the light came horizontal through the maple trees and the whole street was the color of something ending well. The departure was different from the arrival. The arrival had been a storm. Massive, deliberate, overwhelming. The departure was a tide going out. Gradual, unhurried. Each engine starting up and pulling into line and easing away with the slight reluctance of people leaving a place where something real happened, carrying it with them in the particular way that real things travel, not in objects, but in people, in the changed weight of the world inside them. Jake stood on the porch and watched them go. He was wearing something he hadn't been wearing that morning. A black vest, sized for him, made specifically and with care, with the Iron Brotherhood symbol, an open road, a rising sun, the promise of forward motion, stitched on the back in red and gold thread. Beneath it, in small, clean letters, Honorary Brother. Bones had put it on his shoulders himself, in the yard, in front of whoever was watching, with the seriousness of a ceremony being performed correctly. Not theatrical, weighty, the kind of seriousness that means what is being transferred is real. Doesn't mean you owe us anything, Bones had said, straightening the back of the vest with one large hand. Means we know who you are. Means when you need something, you don't have to figure out whether to ask. Jake had looked up at him. I know who you are too, he said. You're the guy my dad saved. Bobby Morrison had not cried in front of another person since 2007. He came very close. Now Jake watched the last taillights diminish at the end of Maple Street and curve onto Route 9, heading back toward Trenton and Baltimore and Hartford and Boston and Providence and the long roads between, heading back to lives that would continue, carrying this day in them the way metal carries heat, invisibly, persistently, transmitting warmth long after the source has passed. When the street was quiet, Jake went back to the yard. He stood in front of the new memorial. The solar light had come on as the sky deepened, a warm, steady amber that made the engraved letters of Rex's name appear almost luminous, as though the stone itself held light rather than merely reflecting it. The garden was impossibly beautiful for something built in a single day. The plantings arranged with an architect's instinct for composition, the stone border laid with a mason's precision, the small bench set at exactly the angle where the morning light would reach it first. Everything was calibrated to last. Jake sat on the bench. He looked at Rex's name in the amber light. He looked at his father's name below it, small and certain and permanent. He took the photograph from his pocket, the one Bones had brought for him, in its protective sleeve, the one of a young Bones and a golden Rex and a laughing Mike Miller on a porch step in the afternoon sun. He held it carefully in both hands. Before the ride, there had been something Jake had carried everywhere that he had never found words for. Not exactly grief. Grief he understood. Grief had a shape he knew. Something additional. Something that had grown quietly in the 3 years since his father died. A formless, low-frequency doubt about whether the world was the kind of place that noticed when something mattered. Whether the love that builds a stone memorial out of $47.23 and blistered hands and a summer of work means anything to anyone beyond the person who built it. Whether the things you love without return, a dead dog, a lost father, a corner of a yard, whether they leave any mark beyond the private one in you. He knew the answer now. Inside, through the kitchen window, he could see Sandra on the phone, smiling a real smile. The full one, the one that reached her eyes, the one he hadn't seen often enough lately. The gutter was fixed. The porch step held firm. The faucet was silent. On the kitchen table, under a coffee mug Sandra had placed on it as a paperweight, was an envelope that had arrived that afternoon by registered mail with the return address of a law office in Trenton. Jake had read the letter inside it twice, sitting at the kitchen table, while Sandra stood behind him with both hands on his shoulders. The Iron Brotherhood Scholarship Fund, established in honor of Michael Thomas Miller and Rex Miller, is pleased to announce the establishment of a full college scholarship in the name of Jacob Michael Miller, to be held in trust until his 18th birthday, at which time. He had put it down and stared at the ceiling for a while. Then he had come outside. Sitting in the amber light now, with Rex's name before him and his father's name beside it, and the photograph of his father laughing held in his hands, Jake Miller felt something he had not felt in 3 years. Not absence, presence. His father had been here in every real sense, had built things that weren't in granite, built them in people, in the kind of man Bones had become after that February night, in the brothers who had driven through the dark because Mike Miller had once broken down a door, in the 1,000 people on a street who had come because love asks something of the people who witness it, and the right people answer. His father had built all of that and not known he was building it. The way people build the things that last, not intentionally, not for an audience, but by being exactly themselves in every specific moment of their lives. And Rex had been the hinge of it, the golden, unremarkable, extraordinary hinge on which the whole long story had swung. Jake placed the photograph gently against the base of the stone, sheltered from the wind by the border of the new garden, and looked at it there. His father's face caught in the amber light, laughing, alive, one hand on the shoulder of the man his dog had saved, his dog leaning into them both with the complete and generous weight of something that has never once doubted it was loved. "Hey, Rex," Jake said quietly. "Hey, Dad." The maple tree at the corner of the yard moved in a small wind off the fields to the east. The leaves made their continuous, small sound, the sound of living things in air, which is to say, the sound of everything still here. Jake sat on the bench until the first stars came through the deepening blue above the street. He was not alone. He had not been alone for a long time. He was only now beginning to understand how long.